Lady Helena Sinclair had spent her entire life defying expectations. A woman of intellect, wit, and an unfortunate tendency to speak her mind, she had shocked the ton by choosing medicine over matrimony. But nothing had prepared her for the letter she now held in her trembling hands. It had arrived that morning, sealed with the unmistakable crest of the Duke of Ravenshire. A summons, a command, a plea. His Grace required her presence at Blackthorne Hall to care for his ailing mother. The request was unusual. Women were hardly accepted in the field of medicine, and certainly not by a man of his rank. But the Duke was desperate, and desperation, she had learned, could make even the most arrogant of men reconsider their prejudices. The carriage ride to Blackthorne Hall was long, the roads uneven, and the air thick with mist. Helena kept herself occupied with thoughts of her patient. The Dowager Duchess of Ravenshire, a woman of considerable influence, had been unwell for months. If Helena succeeded in treating her, she could prove once and for all that a woman's mind was as sharp as a man's scalpel. But as the grand estate loomed into view, an unsettling feeling crept into her chest. Something was amiss. The air was too still, the silence too heavy. It was as if the house itself held its breath. Upon arrival, a footman escorted her into the grand foyer, where opulence reigned. Chandeliers dripped with crystals, the marble floors gleamed under candlelight, and yet the house felt haunted. Before she could analyze the sensation further, a deep voice interrupted her thoughts. "You are Lady Helena Sinclair." It was not a question. She turned and met the gaze of Nicholas Everleigh, the Duke of Ravenshire. He was not the frail, aging man she had expected, but rather a force of nature, broad-shouldered, impossibly tall, and with a gaze so piercing it could strip a person bare. His dark brown hair was slightly disheveled, as though he had run his fingers through it one too many times, and his eyes, hazel with flecks of gold, assessed her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. "I am," she replied, straightening her posture. "You require my services," his jaw clenched. "My mother requires them," Helena arched a brow. "And yet it is you who looks as though he hasn't slept in weeks." A flicker of something, amusement, annoyance, crossed his features before he stepped aside, gesturing for her to follow. As she walked through the corridors of Blackthorne Hall, the uneasy feeling returned. Whispers lingered in the air, unseen eyes seemed to watch from the shadows. There was something in this house, something beyond illness and duty, and Helena intended to uncover it. The corridors of Blackthorne Hall stretched endlessly, their flickering candlelight casting restless shadows against the walls. Helena followed the Duke in silence, her trained eyes noting the stiffness in his shoulders, the tightness of his jaw. Whatever illness plagued his mother was not the only burden he carried. Finally they reached an imposing oak door. The Duke paused, his hand resting on the brass handle, as though steeling himself. Then, with a breath so quiet she almost missed it, he pushed it open. The Dowager Duchess of Ravenshire lay in a grand, canopied bed, her silver hair fanned against the pillows like wisps of cloud. Her skin, though pale, held a quiet dignity. Even in illness, she carried herself like a woman accustomed to command. "Your Grace," Helena greeted, stepping forward. "I am Lady Helena Sinclair, the physician summoned to attend you." The old woman's eyes, sharp despite her weakened state, flickered over her. A slow, knowing smile curved her lips. "Ah, so he has done it then." Helena tilted her head. "Done what, Your Grace?" The Dowager cast a glance at her son, a look laden with meaning Helena could not yet decipher. Nicholas's expression darkened, his hands clenching behind his back. "You are unlike the men who have come before you," the Duchess said instead, ignoring the tension in the room. "That alone makes me curious," Helena smiled. "Curiosity, Your Grace, is an excellent sign of health." A quiet chuckle escaped the old woman, but Nicholas was not as amused. "Lady Helena," he interjected, His voice clipped. "I will leave you to your work. Send for me if my mother's condition worsens." With a curt nod, he strode out of the room, the door clicking shut behind him. Helena turned back to her patient, but before she could speak, the dowager murmured, "Do not mind him. He is a man burdened by duty, though not the duty he wishes to bear." Helena frowned. "And what duty is that?" The Duchess did not answer. Instead, she reached for Helena's hand, her fingers cold yet firm. "Beware, child. This house holds secrets, and secrets, when left in the dark, tend to fester." A chill ran down Helena's spine. Outside, in the dimly lit hallway, the Duke of Ravenshire stood unmoving, his back against the wall. His mother's words echoed in his mind. Secrets fester, and if Lady Helena Sinclair stayed in this house long enough, she would uncover them all. Helena worked in silence, her hands steady as she checked the dowager's pulse. It was weaker than she would have liked, but not alarming. However, what troubled her most was not the woman's frailty, but the strange, lingering feeling in the room, something just out of reach, like a whispered warning she could not yet decipher. As she examined the Duchess, she noticed faint bruises along the woman's wrist. They were small, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably there. A fall? No, the placement was too precise, pressure marks. Someone had held her too tightly. Before she could ask, the dowager's tired eyes met hers. "You are already questioning things, aren't you?" Helena hesitated before answering. "It is in my nature to seek answers, Your Grace." A weak smile. "Be careful. In this house, the answers do not always wish to be found." The cryptic warning settled in Helena's chest like a weight, but before she could press further, the door creaked open. Nicholas stood there, his hazel eyes unreadable, his broad frame filling the doorway. "How is she?" His voice was quieter than before, lacking its earlier sharpness. "She is stable," Helena replied, standing. "But I will need more time to determine the cause of her weakness." Nicholas nodded, stepping further into the room. There was something different in his demeanor now, something Helena could not quite place. Worry? Guilt? Whatever it was, it made her pulse quicken. "I trust you will do everything in your power to help her," he said, his gaze locking onto hers. Helena met his stare without flinching. "I will, even if that means uncovering truths you may not wish to face." A muscle in his jaw ticked, but he said nothing. Instead, he turned to his mother, pressing a brief kiss to her forehead before murmuring, "Rest, Mother." The Duchess gave a knowing smile. "Rest is a luxury in this house, my son, for all of us." Nicholas stiffened but said nothing as he turned back to Helena. "You should settle in. I will have a maid show you to your quarters." As she followed him down the corridor, the silence between them grew thick with unspoken words. Finally, Helena broke it. "She is afraid," she said softly. Nicholas exhaled sharply. "My mother is a stubborn woman." "That is not what I said." He stopped walking and turned to face her. The candlelight flickered against his features, highlighting the hard lines of his face. "You ask too many questions, Lady Helena." She tilted her chin up. "And you avoid too many answers, Your Grace." For a moment, something like amusement flashed in his eyes. Then, just as quickly, it was gone. "Good night, Lady Helena," he said, his voice low. She watched as he disappeared down the corridor. Her mind racing. This house held secrets, and she intended to unearth them all. Sleep did not come easily to Helena that night. The silence of Blackthorne Hall was not the comforting kind, but the sort that pressed against the skin, whispering of unseen things lurking just beyond the edge of candlelight. Her room, though, lavish, felt too vast, the four-poster bed too grand, the heavy drapes too thick, as if meant to muffle sounds that should not be heard. She lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling until at last she gave up on rest altogether. A walk. That was what she needed. A moment to clear her mind. Wrapping a shawl around her shoulders, she stepped into the dimly lit corridor. The sconces flickered, casting shifting shadows along the walls. She walked with careful steps, not entirely sure where she was headed, until she heard it, a voice, low, urgent, and unmistakably male. Helena hesitated, pressing herself against the cool stone wall. She was no eavesdropper, but something in the tone of that voice, the hushed intensity of it, told her that whoever was speaking did not wish to be overheard. Curiosity won. Moving quietly, she followed the sound, pausing at the slightly ajar door of a study. Nicholas, even without seeing him, she knew it was him. His voice was tense, edged with frustration. But it was the second voice that made her breath catch. A woman. She was too far to make out the words, but the softness of the woman's tone sent a strange pang through Helena's chest. And then, laughter. Low, intimate laughter. The kind shared between people who knew each other in ways that could not be spoken aloud. Helena's heart pounded. She should walk away. This was not her business, but just as she turned to leave, the door shifted, opening slightly wider, and in that moment, she saw them. Nicholas stood with his back to her, but his posture, rigid, conflicted, spoke volumes. And in front of him, a woman cloaked in midnight blue, her gloved hands reaching for his. Helena could not see the woman's face, but she saw the way Nicholas looked at her, as if she were something he could not have, as if she were something he wanted anyway, a forbidden romance. Helena's breath hitched, her fingers tightening around the edge of her shawl. Suddenly, as if sensing her presence, Nicholas turned. Their eyes met. For a moment, everything was still. Then Helena did the only thing she could. She turned and fled. Helena's footsteps echoed through the dim corridor as she fled, her breath unsteady, her pulse a frantic drum against her ribs. She should not have seen that. She was not meant to see that. Her mind reeled with questions, none of which she had the right to ask. Who was that woman? A lover, a secret betrothed, and why did Nicholas look at her as if she were both salvation and sin? By the time she reached her chambers, her hands were trembling. She pressed them against the cool wood of the door, willing herself to be rational. This was none of her concern. She was here as a physician, not a gossiping debutante. And yet, when morning came, she found herself unable to meet Nicholas's gaze at breakfast. Not that it mattered. He was entirely preoccupied with his own thoughts. His usual sharp presence was dulled, his expression distant. Even the Dowager Duchess noticed. "You look positively dreadful, my son," she observed, peering at him over the rim of her teacup. "Did you sleep at all?" Nicholas barely looked up. "I was occupied." Helena's grip tightened on her spoon. Oh, she knew. The Duchess hummed. Occupied, indeed. A silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Helena forced herself to eat, though every bite tasted like dust. When she could stand it no longer, she set her spoon down with deliberate care. "Your Grace," she said, turning to the Duchess, "if you are well enough, I should like to examine you properly today." The old woman smirked, as if amused by Helena's sudden intensity. "Of course, my dear, I should hate to keep you from your work." Nicholas rose abruptly. "I will be in my study if I am needed." His chair scraped against the floor as he pushed it back, his movements tense. Helena did not watch him leave. She would not. But as she turned back to her patient, the Dowager Duchess reached across the table, patting Helena's hand with surprising warmth. "You have seen something you wish you had not, haven't you?" Helena stiffened. "I don't know what you mean." The Duchess chuckled. "Oh, my dear, you do. And now you must decide, will you pretend ignorance or will you seek the truth?" Helena swallowed, her throat suddenly dry, because she already knew the answer. She would seek the truth, even if it destroyed her. The day stretched long, filled with routine examinations and careful notes. Helena did her best to focus, but the image of Nicholas and the mysterious woman haunted her thoughts. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the way his fingers had lingered over the woman's hands, how his posture had been caught between longing and restraint. By nightfall, she had resolved to push it from her mind. She was here as a physician, nothing more, but fate, it seemed, had other plans. As she crossed the corridor leading to her chambers, a voice cut through the quiet. "You saw." She stopped. The candlelight flickered, casting shadows along the walls. Slowly, she turned. Nicholas stood at the end of the hallway, half shrouded in darkness, his hazel eyes unreadable. Helena's heart slammed against her ribs, but she schooled her expression into something impassive. "I do not know what you mean, Your Grace." His jaw tightened. In 2 long strides he closed the distance between them, towering over her, his presence overwhelming. "Do not play coy, Lady Helena. I know you were there." Her throat went dry. She should deny it, should feign ignorance, and yet the words that left her lips were entirely different. "Who is she?" Nicholas flinched, actually flinched. A muscle in his jaw ticked, his hands clenching at his sides. "That is none of your concern." "Perhaps not." She lifted her chin, refusing to be cowed by his intensity. "But I was under the impression that Blackthorne Hall had summoned me to seek the truth." His eyes darkened. "Be careful, Helena." It was the first time he had ever said her name, and it sent something traitorous spiraling through her chest. Some truths are not meant to be unearthed. She should have been afraid. A lesser woman might have trembled beneath the weight of his warning. But Helena only took a step closer, tilting her head in challenge. And yet, they always have a way of revealing themselves. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The tension was thick enough to cut with a blade, the air between them charged with something neither of them wanted to name. Then, without another word, Nicholas turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving Helena breathless and entirely, irrevocably consumed by the question that refused to let her go. Who was that woman? And why did the thought of Nicholas loving someone else feel like a wound she could not bear? Helena was not a woman prone to distraction. She had spent years training her mind to focus solely on her work, ignoring the petty dramas that consumed the ton. And yet Nicholas Everleigh had undone her in a matter of days. By the time evening fell, she was no closer to unraveling the mystery of the woman in the study. The Dowager Duchess had been stable throughout the day, though Helena's suspicions lingered. Her patient's weakness did not seem entirely natural. But every time she attempted to push forward in her examination, the old woman would give her a knowing smile, as if to say, "There are more pressing matters at hand, my dear." Helena would have argued otherwise. But then, at supper, Nicholas spoke. "There will be a ball at Blackthorne Hall tomorrow evening." His voice was composed, but his gaze flickered briefly to Helena's before settling back on his plate. "The invitations have already been sent." Helena frowned. "A ball? While your mother is unwell?" The dowager chuckled. "Oh, do not be so severe, my dear. I insisted upon it. If I am to endure endless days of bedrest, I should at least enjoy some entertainment." Helena's lips pressed into a thin line. The idea of a grand ball in the midst of such an uneasy atmosphere seemed reckless. But then she caught the way Nicholas's fingers tightened around his wineglass. This was not merely a ball. It was something else, and she had the distinct impression that the mysterious woman would be in attendance. The following evening, Blackthorne Hall was transformed. The grand ballroom shimmered beneath candlelit chandeliers, music swelling through the air as finely dressed ladies twirled in the arms of eager gentlemen. Helena had not intended to attend. She had told herself quite sternly that she was above such trivial distractions. But somehow she found herself standing at the top of the staircase, watching the scene unfold below her, and then she saw her, the woman in midnight blue. She moved through the crowd with an effortless grace, her gown flowing like water, her golden jewelry glinting beneath the candlelight. And Nicholas, he was watching her. Helena's chest tightened. But then, as if sensing her gaze, Nicholas turned. His eyes locked onto hers from across the room, something unreadable flickering in their depths. And before she could even think to move, he was making his way toward her. "You came," he murmured, stopping before her. Helena lifted her chin. "It would seem so." A muscle in his jaw twitched. "Dance with me." She hesitated. This was a mistake, a foolish, reckless mistake, and yet, when he offered his hand, she took it. Helena knew she should not be here. She should not be standing in the center of Blackthorne Hall's grand ballroom, her hand resting lightly in the Duke's, her breath unsteady as he pulled her into the waltz. And yet, she did not let go. Nicholas led her effortlessly through the dance, his grip firm yet careful, as though he were unsure whether to hold her closer or let her go entirely. The music swelled around them, but Helena hardly heard it. All she could focus on was the heat of his touch, the way his hazel eyes darkened when they met hers. "This is a dangerous game you're playing, Your Grace," she murmured, forcing a coolness into her voice that she did not feel. His lips curved into something that was not quite a smile. "And what game would that be?" She arched a brow. "The one where you pretend that nothing is amiss in this house, that your mother is merely unwell, that you do not disappear into the shadows of your own home in the dead of night." Nicholas's jaw tensed, his steps faltering for the briefest of moments. "You truly cannot help yourself, can you?" "No," she admitted, her voice quieter now. "I cannot." For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, as the dance brought them closer, his breath brushed against her ear. "Then meet me in the library after the last dance." Her heart slammed against her ribs, but before she could respond, the waltz ended. Nicholas released her hand and stepped back, his face once again a mask of careful indifference. Without another word, he turned and disappeared into the crowd. Helena exhaled slowly. Foolish, this was utterly foolish. And yet, when the last dance was played and the guests began to depart, she found herself slipping away from the ballroom, her pulse thrumming with something she dared not name. The library was dimly lit, the golden glow of the fireplace casting long shadows across the shelves. Nicholas stood near the hearth, a glass of brandy in hand. He did not turn when she entered, but she knew he had been waiting. "You came," he murmured. Helena closed the door behind her. "You asked me to." A humorless chuckle. "Yes, and I find myself regretting it already." She crossed her arms. "Then why did you?" At last, he turned to face her. The weight in his eyes sent a shiver down her spine. "Because you want answers," he said, his voice low, "and I am tired of pretending I do not wish to give them to you." Helena swallowed. "Who is she?" Nicholas stared at her for a long moment. Then finally he spoke. "She is my brother's wife." The words hit Helena like a blow. A brother, a marriage, a secret. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. Because she knew with terrifying certainty that this revelation was only the beginning, and whatever truth lay ahead, it would change everything. Helena stood frozen, Nicholas's words ringing in her ears. "She is my brother's wife." 1,000 questions burned on her tongue, but for the first time in her life, she found herself speechless. Nicholas turned away, staring into the flickering firelight. His face, usually so composed, was shadowed with something Helena could not quite name. Pain, perhaps, or something darker. "You never mentioned a brother," she finally said, her voice quieter than she intended. Nicholas let out a slow, measured breath. Because it is easier to pretend he does not exist. The weight of his words sent a chill through her. What happened to him? He hesitated. Then, without looking at her, he answered, "He died." Helena's breath hitched. "I am sorry." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Are you? You do not even know how." She took a step closer, searching his face for the truth he would not say. "Then tell me." For a long moment she thought he would refuse. But then, as if something inside him had cracked, he spoke. "William was my elder brother, the rightful Duke of Ravenshire." His voice was careful, controlled. He was reckless, charming. He could convince the devil himself to strike a bargain and make him think it was his idea. Helena's chest tightened. There was something about the way Nicholas spoke of him, something that hinted at admiration, resentment, and grief, all tangled together. "We were not close," he continued, "not in the way brothers should be. He lived as if the world owed him pleasure, and I cleaned up the messes he left behind." She could not ignore the bitterness in his tone. "And his wife." At this, Nicholas's expression darkened. "Juliana." The name was a sigh, a confession. She was everything he did not deserve. Kind, clever, impossibly loyal. She loved him more than he ever knew. Helena swallowed. "And now?" Nicholas exhaled sharply. "And now she is a widow, trapped in a world that will never forgive her for marrying the wrong brother." A strange, unfamiliar ache spread through Helena's chest. "How did he die?" Silence. "Then he was murdered." Helena's breath caught. Nicholas finally met her gaze, and for the first time she saw it, the truth that had haunted him all this time. "I have spent the last 2 years trying to find out who killed him," he said, his voice low. "And the closer I get, the more I realize someone in this house does not want me to succeed." Helena shivered. Blackthorne Hall held secrets, and she had just walked straight into the heart of them. Helena's pulse thundered in her ears. Murder! The word hung between them, thick and suffocating. Nicholas Everleigh was not merely grieving his brother, he was hunting his killer. 1,000 thoughts tangled in her mind, but before she could speak, a sudden creak echoed through the library. Both of them froze. Helena turned sharply, her breath catching. The door stood slightly ajar. Had it been opened before? Nicholas was already moving. He reached the door in 3 strides, yanked it open, and stepped into the corridor. Silence. Helena followed cautiously, her senses on high alert. "Do you think someone was listening?" Nicholas's jaw clenched. "I do not think. I know." A chill ran down her spine. Blackthorne Hall had never felt more ominous. The walls themselves seemed to breathe with secrets, the flickering candlelight casting shifting shadows that made her skin prickle. Nicholas returned, shutting the door behind him. His hazel eyes burned with something fierce. "You should not have come tonight," Helena exhaled, forcing steadiness into her voice. "It seems to me, Your Grace, that I should have come much sooner." His lips pressed into a thin line. "You do not understand the danger you are in, and you do not understand that I do not scare easily." Nicholas let out a low breath, dragging a hand through his dark hair. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to argue, but then his expression shifted. Something in his eyes softened, something that sent a different kind of shiver down Helena's spine. "You are infuriating," he murmured. She arched a brow. "So, I have been told." The tension between them thickened, shifting into something heavier, something she should not be noticing. Not now. Not like this. Helena stepped back, forcing herself to remember why she was here. "If someone does not want you to find the truth, then that means you are close." Nicholas studied her for a long moment. Then finally, he nodded. "Yes, and that is precisely why you must stay out of it," she scoffed. "You cannot possibly expect me to do that." A flicker of something. Was it amusement? Frustration? Admiration crossed his face. "No, I suppose I cannot." A heavy silence settled between them. Helena knew she had a choice. She could step away, retreat into the safety of her role as his mother's physician, or she could see this through to the end. But she already knew the answer. She was in this now, and there was no turning back. Epilogue, a choice that changes everything. The storm raged outside Blackthorne Hall, rain lashing against the windows like a whispered warning. Inside, the candlelight flickered, casting trembling shadows across the grand corridors. Helena stood in the library once more, her heart a storm of its own. She should not be here. She should have left long ago, taken her medical bag and walked away from this house of secrets, but she could not. Not when Nicholas had just told her the truth. Not when his mother, the Dowager Duchess, had finally admitted what she had long suspected. William was not meant to die that night. Helena's hands clenched at her sides. "You knew, didn't you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The Dowager Duchess, seated by the fire, lifted her gaze to Helena's. There was no shock, no protest of innocence, only quiet acceptance. "Yes," a lump formed in Helena's throat. "And you said nothing?" The old woman sighed. "What would you have had me do, child? Condemn my own household? Name a murderer when I had no proof?" Helena shook her head. "He was your son," the dowager's gaze did not waver. "And Nicholas is my only son now. Do you think I would risk losing him as well?" The weight of her words crushed the air from the room. Nicholas stood in the doorway, silent. He had not spoken since his mother's confession, but Helena could see the war raging inside him. Justice, duty, family, love. He could not have them all. At last he met Helena's gaze, and something passed between them. An understanding, a truth neither of them had spoken aloud. She had come here to heal, but instead she had uncovered something far more dangerous. And now she had a choice to make: stay and fight beside him or walk away forever. The storm howled outside. Helena took a breath and stepped closer. The end or the beginning?